In the vast, windswept expanse of the North Atlantic, where bitter winds carved waves into jagged walls of water, few knew how many aircraft simply vanished during the darkest years of the Second World War. One of the least documented and least understood was the disappearance of a Lockheed Hudson from No. 206 Squadron, RAF Coastal Command in early 1941. Official reports would eventually compress the incident into a few clinical lines. But behind those lines were unanswered questions, unrecorded fears, and the quiet alarm of a command stretched thin across thousands of hostile miles. The Hudson crew took off from RAF Bircham Newton on a frigid February morning, tasked with a long-range reconnaissance sweep across the North Atlantic air gap. Their mission: locate U-boats prowling the lanes of convoy HX-107, then under heavy threat from Admiral Donit's wolf packs. At the time, Coastal Command was still regarded as the under-resourced cousin of Bomber Command. Aircraft were aging, radar sets were primitive, and air crews often flew with little more than a map, a compass, and a flare gun. Yet the men of 206 Squadron faced the ocean day after day, fully aware that any mechanical failure meant near-certain death. Crew lists from the squadron's February records name Flight Lieutenant Arthur McKinnon as pilot, 29 years old, experienced, calm under strain. His navigator, Sergeant John Hemsley, had written in a letter days earlier, "Weather turning rough again. Visibility will be our real enemy soon." Those words, recovered decades later from family archives, foreshadowed everything that followed. The Hudson lifted into a low ceiling of cloud, then disappeared into the gray void beyond the Norfolk coast. The mission proceeded uneventfully for the first 2 hours. Radio logs show a routine check-in at 0924 hours. Nothing unusual. No panic. No hint of trouble. And then at precisely 0941, the aircraft failed to respond to a scheduled signal check. Operators tried again at 0945. Then at 0955. Silence. At first, Coastal Command chalked it up to weather interference, a common issue in winter. But as the hours passed and expected position reports failed to come through, concern hardened into dread. Historical context deepens the mystery. Luftwaffe long-range fighters, particularly the Junkers Ju-88C, had begun prowling deep over the ocean, hunting British patrol aircraft. Several Hudsons had already been ambushed without warning. Yet German records for that morning list no confirmed engagements in the area. Meteorological data for February 11, 1941 paints another grim possibility: a fast-moving cold front pushing high winds and freezing rain across the Hudson's flight path. With limited de-icing capability, the aircraft was vulnerable. A sudden buildup of ice on the wings or tail could have turned the aircraft into dead weight. Still, something didn't fit. The crew never sent a distress call. Even catastrophic icing tended to give pilots seconds, enough time for a clipped SOS. Moreover, an Admiralty tracking report filed 3 days later described an unresolved radar trace, detected by a Royal Navy escort vessel in roughly the same. In the spring of 1941, as the Battle of the Atlantic intensified, few outside RAF Coastal Command understood the scale of the silent war unfolding far beyond the sight of Europe's coastlines. Yet, hidden within operational logs and once classified communiques lies a little-known pattern of aircraft disappearing without a trace, losses that seldom made headlines, but whose absence shaped the desperate fight to keep Britain alive. One such event began with what should have been a routine patrol: a Lockheed Hudson of No. 206 Squadron, lifting off from RAF Bircham Newton on a chilly April morning, never to be seen again. For the men of Coastal Command, the North Atlantic was less a battlefield and more an ever-expanding void. Crews fought not only against U-boats and wandering Luftwaffe aircraft, but against brutal weather, unforgiving seas, and the constant threat of mechanical failure. On April 14, 1941, Flight Lieutenant Ian Markham and his four-man crew were assigned a standard sector sweep west of the Hebrides, a patrol that countless crews had flown before. The Hudson, tail number T9324, had passed its pre-flight inspection without issue, and the men joked with ground staff as they loaded depth charges beneath the wings. Their mission: intercept any U-boats reported shadowing convoy HX-120 as it made its way toward the Clyde. Once airborne, the Hudson climbed into scattered cloud, maintaining radio contact during the first leg of its outward run. Conditions were typical for the region: low visibility, intermittent rain, and headwinds strong enough to slow progress. Still, nothing suggested what would follow. According to Coastal Command's daily operations log, the aircraft's last confirmed transmission came at 10:42 hours, a position report, calm, routine, and entirely unremarkable. Then silence. At first no one worried. Radio interference in the North Atlantic was common, and aircraft often dipped below receiving range during low-altitude sweeps. But as hours passed and fuel exhaustion loomed, concern tightened into anxiety. Squadron leader Douglas Shaw later recalled in his diary, "Markham was steady veteran, none of us believed he'd simply vanish. If they were down, someone should have seen something. A raft, a flare, anything." When the Hudson failed to return by late afternoon, RAF search and rescue aircraft were dispatched along its planned route. They found nothing. No oil slick, no debris, no faint patch of yellow from a life jacket drifting between waves. The sea, endlessly churning, gave up no clues. Intelligence officers immediately considered a possible Luftwaffe interception. At the time, German Ju-88s of Küstenfliegergruppe 806 operated out of Norway and frequently harassed Allied patrols along the northern approaches. Yet Luftwaffe records inspected after the war contained no claim matching the Hudson's disappearance. Another possibility, one that commanders hesitated to voice, was mechanical failure at low altitude. The Hudson was reliable but not flawless. Pilots often complained of erratic fuel gauges and sudden carburetor icing when temperatures dipped unexpectedly. A single engine failure over the frigid Atlantic could doom a crew within minutes, especially in rough seas where ditching was perilous. But even then, the absence of debris frustrated investigators. Aircraft rarely vanished wholly. Something always floated. The mystery deepened months later when a decrypted German naval intercept referenced a British patrol aircraft, seen circling a surfaced U-boat near the Hebrides on the very morning T-93-24 disappeared. The intercept noted the U-boat crash-dived, followed by no further observation of enemy aircraft. Analysts debated whether the Hudson had attacked and been struck by anti-aircraft fire, or whether the sighting referred to an entirely different aircraft altogether. With incomplete dates and vague positions, the message never offered definitive answers. What remains most striking is how swiftly the Hudson and its crew faded into obscurity. With Coastal Command stretched thin, losses, whether confirmed or mysterious, piled up with cold regularity. Families were notified, a short memorial held at Bircham Newton, and the squadron returned to its relentless rotation of patrols. The war offered little time for reflection. Yet modern historians often return to T-93-24's disappearance not because it was unique, but because it exemplifies the uncertainty that haunted early war Coastal Command operations. The North Atlantic was an environment where nature, enemy action, and human endurance collided with unpredictable results. With incomplete records and an ocean capable of swallowing evidence whole, many wartime events left behind only questions. Even today, the fate of Markham and his crew remains unresolved. Was it weather? A mechanical fault? A fleeting encounter with the Luftwaffe, or a U-boat that left no survivor to tell the story? The official record offers silence, mirroring the final, unanswered radio call. And as more files were declassified decades later, investigators began to notice patterns among several similar losses, patterns that would set the stage for the next case, an equally haunting disappearance in the freezing waters off Iceland. By September 1941, the Atlantic had become a graveyard for both ships and aircraft, yet few losses struck Coastal Command as deeply as the disappearance of a Sunderland flying boat from No. 10 Squadron RAF. These massive, 9-man patrol craft, nicknamed Flying Porcupines for their heavy defensive armament, were renowned for surviving tremendous punishment in combat. But on the night of September 12, one of them, Sunderland W3986, vanished somewhere in the frigid expanse south of Iceland. Its loss, logged briefly in wartime summaries, would remain shrouded in fragments of radio messages, conflicting intelligence reports, and the unrelenting silence of the northern seas. The crew had departed from RAF Reykjavik under worsening weather forecasts, yet such missions were far from unusual. Convoys were being hunted relentlessly by packs of German U-boats operating from French Atlantic bases. The Sunderlands of No. 10 Squadron were among the few Allied aircraft capable of long-range patrols in these waters, providing overwatch for merchant vessels that might otherwise be stalked for days. Pilot Officer Edward Ted Morgan, a calm but driven Australian aviator, commanded W3986 that night, leading his men toward an area where 3 merchant ships had recently reported suspicious wake trails. Almost immediately after takeoff, the crew fought the elements. Heavy icing formed along the wing leading edges as Arctic winds swept across the aircraft. Flying Officer Arthur Mantle, the navigator, scribbled in his log, "Visibility poor. Turbulence increasing. Radar intermittent due to static." The Sunderland dipped in and out of cloud banks as Morgan pushed southward, determined to investigate the convoy's distress signals. Their last clear transmission to Reykjavik, received at 21:17 hours, mentioned adverse weather but provided no hint of imminent danger. Then another message came, faint and broken, just minutes later. Operators recorded fragments: contact, large vessel, illumination, closing in. It was cryptic, and at the time was interpreted as an encounter with a surfaced U-boat using a searchlight or star shell for identification. But the message ended abruptly, swallowed by static. When Reykjavik attempted to re-establish contact, no reply ever came. Weather prevented an immediate search. Gale force winds hammered the region through the night, grounding rescue aircraft and forcing escorts to hold position near their convoys. When conditions finally improved 18 hours later, multiple units, including Catalinas from No. 209 Squadron and 2 Sunderlands from No. 201 Squadron, combed the area extensively. Once again the Atlantic gave up nothing. Oil slicks were common, debris was non-existent, and no raft or body surfaced to offer even the faintest clue. Coastal Command investigators initially attributed the loss to weather, icing, turbulence, or disorientation. But not long after the war, intelligence officers revisiting German naval archives uncovered a puzzling possibility. Logs from the Hilfskreutzer Komet, a commerce-raiding auxiliary cruiser operating clandestinely in the Arctic Ocean, placed the vessel in a suspiciously similar sector on the same night W-3986 disappeared. Although Komet made no claim of shooting down aircraft, its operational track lines were incomplete, and its commander's radio reports hinted at an unexpected nighttime air alarm around 2100 hours. If W-3986 had mistaken Komet for a U-boat, or vice versa, an encounter may have escalated quickly. Sunderlands typically attacked surface submarines immediately, attempting to drop depth charges before the enemy could dive. Against a surface raider equipped with heavy anti-aircraft guns, however, such an attack would have been fatal. It is a scenario some historians consider plausible, especially given the broken transmission mentioning a large vessel under illumination. Yet skeptics point out that this theory rests on circumstantial timing and location. Others suggested structural failure due to severe icing, noting that multiple Sunderlands suffered dangerous ice buildup near Iceland. The aircraft's bulk made it resilient but not invincible. A wing stall or asymmetric ice load could send even a Sunderland into an unrecoverable dive. Pilot Officer Morgan's family held on to a different possibility for decades: mechanical failure during a low-altitude investigation. In a letter now preserved in Australia's National Archives, his brother wrote, "Ted never feared combat, but he hated the weather. If the engines iced or sputtered, they'd never stand a chance that night." The emotional weight of the speculation remains palpable, echoing through decades of unanswered questions. Modern analysts reviewing the case have found that the last radar echo recorded by Reykjavik Station, logged hastily by a junior operator, may have depicted an aircraft suddenly losing altitude, though the signal strength was too weak to confirm. If true, it could support either theory: enemy action or catastrophic icing. The problem is that no corroborating data survived. Wartime recording equipment was primitive and often unreliable during storms. What lingers most is the eerie, unresolved combination of two factors: a mysterious vessel sighting and a disappearance leaving no trace. Not even fragments of float, metal, or paper washed up on Iceland's shores in the months that followed. For a large aircraft like a Sunderland, this level of finality remains highly unusual. As additional files were declassified in later decades, investigators noticed that W-3986's disappearance was not isolated. Several Coastal Command aircraft would vanish under similarly perplexing circumstances in the northern theaters, one of them a Beaufort bomber on a daring strike over Norwegian waters, whose loss would introduce yet another layer of mystery. By May 1942, RAF Coastal Command had expanded far beyond its early war patrol patterns. Now, aircraft were striking deep into occupied Norway, attempting to disrupt German supply routes feeding the powerful Kriegsmarine units stationed in fjords from Trondheim to Narvik. It was during this surge of offensive operations that a Bristol Beaufort of No. 42 Squadron disappeared under circumstances that remain one of the squadron's most troubling unsolved losses. The Beaufort, a compact yet formidable torpedo bomber, had earned a reputation for rugged reliability, making its sudden vanishing all the more unsettling. The story begins on May 17, 1942 at RAF Leuchars in Scotland, where the squadron prepared for a daring daylight attack against German shipping near the Vestfjord approaches. Reconnaissance photographs revealed a small convoy escorted by flak trawlers moving steadily down the Norwegian coast. Planners hoped to intercept it before it reached the protection of fighter patrols near Bodo. Among the participating aircraft was Beaufort DW-967, piloted by Flight Sergeant Harold Fenwick, a seasoned aviator with over 200 operational hours. His three-man crew trusted him implicitly, but they also harbored private concerns. The aircraft had recently suffered intermittent electrical failures, causing flickering instruments and a momentary radio blackout during a training sortie. Ground crews worked extensively on the Beaufort, tightening connections, replacing relays, and conducting a full systems check. Everything appeared functional when Fenwick inspected the aircraft that morning. Yet the squadron's operations officer later noted that the crew's departure was marked with an unfamiliar quiet, as if a tension hung in the air that no amount of maintenance could dispel. Even so, orders were orders, and DW-967 joined 8 other Beauforts as they lifted off into a pale northern sky. The formation crossed the North Sea at low altitude, skimming over cresting waves to evade German radar. Icing was light, visibility excellent, and spirits cautiously optimistic. Approaching the Norwegian coast, the pilots climbed slightly to cross the first line of jagged cliffs. From there, they descended again, following the fjords like winding corridors carved by ancient glaciers. The attack plan was simple: approach from the southwest, release torpedoes at the lead freighter, and escape north before Luftwaffe units could respond. But somewhere north of Lofoten, DW-967 broke formation. According to post-sortie reports, the aircraft drifted steadily right before falling behind the group. Fenwick's last radio transmission, calm but strained, stated simply, "Electrical again, attempting reset." Continuing north. Whether he intended to regain formation or divert to a secondary route remains unknown. The message ended abruptly. No one saw the Beaufort again. The attack force completed its run, hitting one freighter and damaging another, but Fenwick's crew did not return to base. Initially, commanders assumed a mechanical fault forced them to ditch at sea. But the Beaufort's emergency dinghy never surfaced, nor did any debris wash ashore along the Norwegian coast. This absence immediately puzzled investigators. Even heavily damaged Beauforts usually left recoverable fragments, wooden spars, seat cushions, documentation bags, or oil streaks. The total lack of evidence suggested a sudden, catastrophic event. Later that week, British intelligence analysts intercepted a decrypted communication from German radar units stationed near Viceroy Island. The report described tracking a solitary aircraft at low altitude, heading northeast, around the same time Fenwick transmitted his final message. Moments later, radar contact was lost. No anti-aircraft batteries reported firing, and no Luftwaffe units claimed a kill in that region on May 17. The German report concluded with the ambiguous note, "Signal ceased abruptly, possible sea impact." But one more detail revived interest decades later. A retired Norwegian fisherman interviewed in the 1990s for a regional oral history project recalled seeing an aircraft flying unusually low, trailing white smoke, near Rost on a spring day in 1942. He remembered the sound cutting off suddenly as if the engines failed in unison. Though heartfelt and credible, his testimony could not be conclusively linked to DW-967, but it matched the geographic window almost perfectly. Some historians argue that the Beaufort suffered complete electrical failure, causing loss of instrumentation and radio, followed by navigational disorientation. Others suspect the sudden disappearance from radar reflects a steep, unrecoverable dive caused by a mechanical seizure in one or both engines. But there remains a third possibility, raised quietly in wartime intelligence reports and only declassified decades later. A German night fighter detachment, flying experimental patrols from Bardufoss, may have been operating in the area without recording engagements in their official logs. If DW-967 encountered a roving Bf-110 or Ju-88, a single burst of cannon fire could have destroyed the aircraft before Fenwick could transmit again. No theory has ever been proven. DW-967's loss marked a somber moment for No. 42 Squadron, reinforcing the vulnerability of crews pushing deep into enemy-held territory with aging aircraft and inconsistent equipment. It also underscored how easily the remote Arctic environment could erase every trace of an aircraft, and every clue needed to understand its final minutes. Yet the pattern of unexplained losses did not end there. Less than a year later, another Coastal Command aircraft, this time a long-range Liberator, would vanish while escorting a convoy locked in combat with a wolf pack. And its final moments, too, would leave investigators grasping for answers. By early 1943, RAF Coastal Command had transformed into a formidable anti-submarine force, equipped with long-range liberators capable of patrolling the full breadth of the North Atlantic. Their presence had begun to shift the momentum of the Battle of the Atlantic, forcing U-boats to dive earlier, stay submerged longer, and attack less frequently. Yet even as Allied capabilities grew, the ocean remained a battlefield where steel, weather, and chance conspired to erase aircraft without warning. One of the most haunting of these losses occurred on February 23, 1943, when a consolidated Liberator of No. 120 Squadron vanished while escorting convoy on 166 during one of the fiercest convoy battles of the war. Convoy on 166, a westbound group of more than 60 merchant ships, was already under attack by multiple U-boats when the Liberator, coded H for Harry, arrived on station. Led by Flight Lieutenant Ernest Delaney, the crew were seasoned veterans of long-range patrols and credited with several confirmed U-boat sightings. Their aircraft was equipped with ASV Mk.3 radar, lee light housing, and a full complement of depth charges, tools that made them among the most effective U-boat hunters in the Atlantic. Morale among the crew was high, but the conditions were brutal. Winds gusting at over 40 knots, heavy seas cresting at 30 feet, and cloud cover in shifting, chaotic layers. Delaney's first transmission logged a radar contact northeast of the convoy. The message, investigating surface echo, sent hope rippling through the escort ships below. Moments later, flares seen by sailors aboard the HMS Burza lit up the cloud base, followed by what appeared to be distant bursts of gunfire. Crewmen on the destroyer later recalled the echoes of engine roar mixed with the faint rattle of machine guns, sounds lost almost immediately in the raging wind. No one could confirm exactly what they saw. Under such conditions, even trained observers often misinterpreted flashes of lightning or reflections on the wave tops. At 15:42 hours, Delaney transmitted again, this time with unmistakable urgency, possible contact. Making approach. It was his final message. Minutes later, a violent Atlantic squall swept across the sector, blocking visibility and severing all further radio communication. By the time the weather eased, H for Harry had disappeared completely. The convoy pressed westward, still under heavy U-boat attack, and no immediate search could be spared. For Coastal Command, the loss was not confirmed until the Liberator failed to return to its base at RAF Ballykelly. In the days that followed, two separate accounts from merchant seamen added bewildering contradictions. Sailors aboard the Greek freighter Stephanotis claimed they saw a large aircraft descending sharply through the clouds, followed by a flash of orange, interpreted as either an explosion or a flare. But crewmen on a nearby American Liberty ship insisted no aircraft appeared in their line of sight, despite being positioned only a few miles away. With visibility shifting by the minute, both accounts were plausible. And both were impossible to verify. Behind the scenes, Coastal Command intelligence officers began comparing Delaney's last radar fix with decrypted German naval traffic. One decoded message from U-boat U-603 mentioned an aircraft detection just before the storm struck. The commander reported diving rapidly and hearing aerial bombs detonate overhead. According to the U-boat log, the explosions were close, perhaps dangerously so, yet no further attack followed. Analysts noted that if the Liberator had made a low-altitude run in worsening weather, a single misjudged pass could have ended disastrously. But the log made no mention of anti-aircraft fire or of the aircraft itself being hit. Another theory emerged from Luftwaffe documents discovered after the war. Though few German aircraft operated that far west, a Ju-290 long-range reconnaissance aircraft from Verkehrsklärungsgruppe 5 had reportedly flown a route near Greenland on the same day. A separate, unconfirmed intelligence note suggested a second Ju-290 might have been dispatched earlier than recorded, potentially crossing paths with On 166. The idea of an armed engagement between the Liberator and a German reconnaissance aircraft intrigued some researchers, but no firm evidence ever surfaced. Still, a final puzzle piece would come years later, when a Coastal Command radar operator, by then elderly, recalled seeing a ghost return on his screen that afternoon. The contact appeared briefly, then vanished, its signal distorted by atmospheric interference. He couldn't determine whether it was the Liberator or a U-boat periscope mast reflecting radar waves. The operator admitted that, at the time, he dismissed it as static from the storm. What truly happened remains a matter of informed speculation. The combination of terrible weather, multiple U-boat contacts, conflicting eyewitness accounts, and incomplete German records created a scenario where many explanations are possible, but none definitive. It is the kind of wartime incident where fact dissolves into uncertainty the moment it meets the Atlantic. For No. 120 Squadron, the loss left an emotional scar. Delaney and his crew had been among their most experienced. Their disappearance during one of the convoy battles that nearly turned the tide of the war made their absence all the more painful. And yet, only a year later, another baffling disappearance would strike Coastal Command, this time involving a Halifax patrol aircraft in the perilous waters of the Bay of Biscay. Its final transmission was even more cryptic. By late 1944, the tides of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. U-boats were no longer the hunters they once were. Now they were the hunted, harried relentlessly by aircraft operating from Britain, Iceland, Gibraltar, and West Africa. Yet even as German submarine operations retreated towards safer northern waters, the Bay of Biscay remained one of the most dangerous regions for Allied patrol aircraft. Heavy flak barges, long-range fighters, and U-boats equipped with new radar detectors made every mission a calculated risk. Into this volatile arena flew Halifax GR.VN Fernan of No. 58 Squadron, which would become one of Coastal Command's most enigmatic late-war losses. The Halifax departed RAF St. David's in Wales on the night of October 2, 1944, tasked with a long-range anti-submarine patrol aimed at intercepting U-boats fleeing Bay of Biscay bases. Although the area had been heavily mined and patrolled, German submarines continued desperate withdrawal operations as Allied pressure tightened across France. Flight Lieutenant Raymond Childs, a disciplined and well-regarded pilot, led a 7-man crew seasoned enough to understand the risks of the assignment. Their Halifax had been recently upgraded with ASV-Mk.X radar, capable of piercing U-boat snorkel emissions, an advantage that commanders believed would compensate for deteriorating weather across the patrol zone. Shortly after takeoff, Childs radioed a calm update, proceeding as planned. Cloud tops at 8,000. Visibility fair. But as the Halifax crossed deeper into the bay, the environment shifted dramatically. By midnight, a blanket of fog and low cloud concealed the sea's surface. The crew switched between radar sweeps and visual searches, using their lee lights sparingly to avoid announcing their presence to German detectors. Tension grew in the dim interior of the aircraft, where the hum of engines blended with the quiet expectation of contact. At 1:12 hours, RAF ground stations recorded a sudden, garbled transmission. Radar pick, possible surface, unusual signal, checking. The message was immediately flagged for follow-up, but attempts to raise Childs again received no response. Unlike earlier disappearances, however, a second, even more cryptic transmission followed minutes later, captured only partially due to static interference. Analysts later transcribed fragments, not submarine, lights, unknown, turning, before the message cut off abruptly. The incomplete nature of the transmission sparked intense debate within Coastal Command. Some officers believed the crew had encountered a surfaced U-boat deploying deception lights, a tactic occasionally used to confuse or mislead patrolling aircraft. Others suggested they'd sighted a small coastal vessel or a drifting mine illuminated by moonlight. But a third possibility emerged when signals intelligence analysts examined the radar logs from that night. The ASV-Mk.X radar operator at St. David's reported receiving an unusual reflection from Childs' aircraft moments before the final transmission. The echo was described as distorted, elongated, and inconsistent with known U-boat signatures, a clue that left technicians puzzled. Could the Halifax have detected a partially submerged U-boat using a snorkel? Or was it picking up interference from one of the radar decoy vessels the Germans occasionally deployed in the Biscay corridor? Lacking a clear comparison, analysts were left with only questions. Adding to the mystery, post-war German naval records contain no claim of shooting down a Halifax that night. Nor did surviving U-boats report being attacked by Allied aircraft in that sector. Luftwaffe operations had diminished significantly by autumn 1944, and no enemy fighters were known to have patrolled the bay during the early hours of October 3. This absence of enemy engagement reports left investigators with the uncomfortable possibility of an accident, a catastrophic structural failure or mid-air explosion caused by the Halifax's increasingly strained engines. Yet no debris was ever found. For an aircraft of that size, total disappearance was rare. Even when ditched at sea, Halifaxes typically left floating wreckage or survival rafts. Nothing washed ashore along the French or Spanish coasts in the days or weeks that followed. For relatives of the crew, this silence was unbearable. One letter preserved in squadron archives recounts a family's anguish. "We do not accept they simply vanished. Something happened out there. Something we've not been told." After the war, an RAF review panel revisited the case while auditing classified Coastal Command losses. The final assessment noted several unresolved anomalies. the distorted radar echo, the cryptic final transmission, and conflicting intelligence about uncharted vessels operating in the bay that night. While none of these threads formed a complete narrative, together they painted a picture of an encounter that defied simple explanation. To historians, the disappearance of N for Nan represents one of the last great mysteries of Coastal Command's operations in the Biscay region. Unlike earlier war losses attributed to fog, icing, or enemy interception, this one occurred at a time when Allied control of the seas was at its peak. That alone made the unexplained nature of the event more troubling and more compelling. But even this case, perplexing as it was, did not stand alone. Throughout the war, certain Coastal Command losses shared patterns of abrupt radio silence, garbled transmissions, and total absence of wreckage. It would take decades and the slow declassification of wartime archives to see how these events fit together. And the final chapter in this series of disappearances would bring investigators full circle, drawing connections across oceans and years.